and welcome to The Sacred. My name is Elizabeth Oldfield, and this is a podcast about our common life and the deep values of the people who shape it. Every episode, I speak to someone who has some kind of public voice or public profile, and I ask them what is sacred to them, by which I mean the deep values that they at least aspire to have guide their life. I speak to people from a really wide range of different backgrounds, professions, political tribes, with the aim to grow myself in empathy and curiosity. And I hope to help you as a listener understand why people might get to different positions than you have reached, or might just be different from you. It came out of a 2017 feeling in me that the rising polarization and tribalism that we were seeing was just not good for any of us. And so I developed this practice of deep listening, not arguing, but just seeking to understand a wide range of people. And the person that I have been trying to understand in the conversation that you're about to hear is Anne McElvoy. Anne is a very successful and senior journalist. She went straight into a graduate trainee scheme after Oxford. She was a columnist in The Telegraph, and she has held a range of editorship roles in the Evening Standard, The Spectator, The Economist, and she's now the head of audio at Politico. She also acts as a panellist on the BBC Radio 4 programme The Moral Maze and a presenter on Radio 3's Night Waves. It's not called Night Waves anymore, it's called Free Thinking. We spoke about growing up in the Northeast, going to a Catholic comprehensive school, what drew her to journalism, what she's trying to do, and why she's increasingly concerned about the way we have public debates, and what she's trying to do about that. There are some reflections from me at the end, but I really hope you enjoy listening. And I am going to kick off with no soft warming up question. We're going to go deep fast. But before I ask you what you think might be sacred to you, I'd love to know how you get on with the word. How did it land with you?
It landed to me as someone who was brought up, Elizabeth, as a Roman Catholic, as the Sacred Heart. It brought back, in good ways and perhaps less good, which we might delve into, a sense of sanctity, observance, mass, and those pictures of the Sacred Heart, which if you were brought up as a Catholic, when I was, born in the mid-60s, so the 70s and 80s, those pictures that were always there of Jesus as the Sacred Heart. So that's where my mind went. And then I started to think, what's sacred to me? And I think that's what you want me to do on this podcast.
Tell me, what bubbled up for you as sacred in your life?
I find the word difficult because I am in that category, depending on my mood and the view of religion, which is that I'm rooted in it. And I don't like a kind of knee-jerk antipathy to religion. But my relationship with the Catholic Church has been more off than on since I was about 13. At the same time, and not only to get the benefits of marriage and sometimes education, sometimes not. We've had a merry mix in our household of observance and non-observance. It does matter to me, I think, that religion counts in some way in our society, in our thinking. So I'm more attracted to the word sacred when people are trying to do down religion than if you were to say to me, oh, how sacred are you finding this or that experience? So I think that's funny. Someone once described this relationship with faith as lapsed but defensive, which I think probably gets it.
Yes, that's beautiful. Can you think of any maybe related to religion or more broadly kind of principles or values which have functioned as sacred in your life, and you sometimes know because they feel transgressed when someone tries to ask you to compromise on them?
I think that's a very good way to put it. And it reminded me of something my father said, and he was hard that generation. He was also an older father when he had me, and he'd been through the war and he'd been injured, and he'd also seen quite active combat in the Valkyrie Islands, which was pretty nasty, close up hand-to-hand combat, which is where he got a lot of shrapnel in his legs, which I only discovered really in older age when it became a problem for him. And he said to me when I wasn't being in a very sacred phase, about going to church at all. He said, look, I don't think that having a religious side of my life has made me a better person, but I think I might have been a worse person without it. And he alluded just to sort of things that had gone wrong, or things that he'd witnessed in wartime, or how he had dealt with moral conundrums. And I think that stuck with me when you say what meant something or means something to me about the word sacred. It's just a little extra check on just maybe doing something that's unkind or that's not necessary. And in a world, and I'm in a very competitive professional world, I'm sure a lot of your guests in different ways are, and quite often I do seek my own advantage, and I can be very ruthless. And I think one of the things that the sacred does is just, even if it's, I'd like to think it's 10% impact, it's probably a lot of weeks, more like 2 or 3, but it's just that little bit that says, actually, I shouldn't have done that, and I should send a note being a bit kinder, or I could do this, but actually, how is this person going to feel? And you could say that's just, a lot of people who don't have any faith, I hope, think in the same way, but there's just that little bit that thinks that's, the religion that I was instilled in me was to think about that. And it's that side of the Christian message that is about your neighbour, and not just your duty, but that you would think of them not only as a neighbour, but as a person, I suppose. And it's easy to forget that, isn't it? We're disaggregated. We're speaking on a screen, we're images to each other. We're sounds, we're images, we're messages, we're texts, we're annoying emails when we've had enough. And how do we just keep looking through that and see that we're having personal interactions and that faith informs it, even if it's at the margin?
Yeah, that's beautiful. I can sort of hear a sense of the sacred functioning as or like your conscience on the bits of you that would otherwise be ruthless and maybe depersonalizing. I'd love to hear a bit more. One of the things you said in an interview about your Radio 4 show, Across the Red Lines, was that our formative experiences and our life stories have a long tail informing of the opinions that we might think of as strikingly rational. So I'm going to push you a little bit, if that's okay. There's not loads about you in the public eye. I'd love you to paint a picture of Anne growing up in County Durham with this kind of Catholic element. What were you like? What were the big ideas in the air?
So I grew up in, as you say, very much in a Roman Catholic world, in my education, in my household. I think my parents, who had married late, neither of them had been married before. There was a bit of the sense of that kind of wartime experience, which I think had disrupted some of their lives and their decisions. There was a sense from childhood. I should tell you about my baptism, because, let's start at the very beginning. A very good place to start, as they say, in The Sound of Music. But I have a very funny baptism story, which I really wish I had been conscious of. At the time, I grew up in a little village called Dipton in County Durham. And my parents went to the local church. Actually, it was split between 2 churches, depending on the mood of my mother, because one was modern and sometimes she thought that was fine. And then as certainly a lot of CB people who have had this experience, particularly Catholics, had that sort of experience of the Mass being very updated from the late 60s into the 70s. And my mother hankered sometimes for the old hymns and the "Oh, Sacred Hearts" and "What Shall I Render Thee?" All of these, which could pour out of me even now. So she would then sort of go up the road the other way to Broom's Church, which is very remote, and in the broom, which was middle of a sort of yellow kind of gorse-like plant that we have in northwest Durham. And so I was very sort of wondering what mood particularly my mother, I think, made this decision of what sort of Mass we were going to get on a Sunday. And of course, as a kid, I wanted the short one. So it was like, please make it modern and have lots of sort of guitar strumming in it. But to return to my baptism, the church burnt down. It was very unfortunate. And the church had fire and burnt down the days before my baptism, which I think was in a kind of latter part of the year, about 6 months after I'd been born. And so I was baptised in a yellow plastic bowl that was used mainly for the washing up. And my mother said, as the water went in, she could sort of see there were just ever so slight traces of the, she thought it was going to bubble up into a fairy liquid moment. Some people talk about having good fairies at christenings. I think she thought it might be literal. So she always says that, I started out in a kind of disruptive way that I intended to go on. And the priest who did it was Father Caden, who became the priest to Tony Blair, Cherie Blair as the Catholic, and later to Tony Blair in Sedgefield when he moved across the aisle from Church of England to Catholicism. So we became friendly then. And obviously, like a good journalist, I wanted to know all about the inner faith life of the Prime Minister and his late path to Rome. But he only remembered me because he baptised me in a plastic bowl, which probably would stay in your mind.
Yes, definitely. And you've alluded to your childhood being a place where ideas were talked about, thought about. Was it just the three of you? Did you have siblings? Tell me a bit about that.
No, I was an only child, and partly because my parents had married so late, I was one of, really in the circumstances, not quite a miracle baby, I don't want to overdo, but my mother was 44 when she had me and, had only been married for a year. And I think we were definitely in the no sex before marriage realm there. So, no, I was really, I think they were as surprised as anyone to find that she was pregnant. And so I was the only child. My mother taught nurses at the local hospital, at Shotley Bridge Hospital. She was absolutely one of those very clever, questing people who had a decent, solid education, but there was, from that background and where she was, and the kind of relative remoteness of growing up in a former mining community, albeit with access. I mean, she was always heading off to Durham to talks at the university. She was very interested in conservation, so she got about a lot. I wasn't brought up in a cloistered world, but she certainly had no formal higher education. And she met my father, who was a sort of laundry chemist, who was head of sort of cleaning, which is actually an incredibly important role across hospitals. And he ended up doing that across a number of hospitals, but they were very different in that he was a sort of self-taught out of the army into the laundry business, where he, as he puts it, nearly helped set up Heart and Clean, in which case we would have been a lot richer. And then he thought, these sort of businesses, who knows if they'll ever work. He didn't believe that washing machine, there was laundrettes. They were supposed to set up laundrettes. And he was of the it'll never work persuasion. Of course, laundrettes became very successful for many decades. So he ended up as a laundry chemist in the NHS, and my mother taught nurses and was an examiner, and was a very, very good sort of, if you're on the academic end of the nursing profession. So that was really my world. But they did always have ideas and debates about ideas, including about faith, certainly about politics. And we debated a lot. My mother, certainly from 1979, when I was a teenager, had enough of trade unions. She was disappointed with it. It was a sort of Labour monoculture, really, County Durham with a little bit of third party sort of SDP had a bit of a moment later, but she was fed up with the Labour Party. She didn't like the trade unions, which she, particularly in the health disputes. My father was Labour through and through and would always have been so. But my mother had a sort of flirtation with Margaret Thatcher. And I think she was about actually to come back to Tony Blair in 97, and she died 2 weeks before the election. So we'll never really know.
Wow. So even in your house, there was kind of different political tribes and it was all up for grabs. Do you ever remember finding it uncomfortable to talk about ideas, or did it always feel like just a part of your home life?
I was really fortunate that way, given that, if you say sort of on paper, when I was applying for university, I would absolutely, and I think rightly, have qualified as coming from an underserved area. I didn't have parents with massive formal education. They had made their way, but they were thoughtful, intelligent people, and that always has guided my view of how politics, policy, and education policy should approach people. It's not always, is it, Elizabeth, as simple as it looks when you see the sort of socio-economics. People can be in one group, or we lived really simply in, a village which was in a wild and beautiful place since the mines had closed, but it was also very stressed. I mean, in the rather awful language of the time, the villages around it were being sort of described as category D villages, where no investment in infrastructure were disappearing. Housing was very cheap.
Yeah.
But it was hard to find. I mean, people who were interested in ideas found each other.
Yeah.
And that I've also often thought is a clue to communities as well. That some of the most interesting conversations and, in a way, informed thinking and got me ready for dialogue in journalism and in politics later and from university was, I felt I heard huge arguments about the miners' strike, for instance, growing up, and not just the which side are you on, but people like my mother who were on kind of both sides at once. She wanted to sort of help miners' welfare, but she really loathed Arthur Scargill. She loathed the strike and she didn't think it should be happening. Yeah. So that sense that people can be, which I think we sometimes lose, and we know in the public debate how easy it is to lose it, that they're not just this one tone, one note thing. And sometimes politics behaves as if they are, hence the Across the Red Line show that I do on Radio 4. But we did argue about pretty much everything. And I think I've once, maybe, you've read it, told the story in a column when I was thinking about how to make Across the Red Line resonate for people who have different views, or their past informs their views, but are they aware of it? Do they want to be aware of it? But we had this massive row, and my friend, Andrea, was staying after school on, it was Thursday night. We always watch Question Time together. And then we'd continue Question Time in kind of a little living room to about midnight. And she said to me, when we went upstairs, when you had your friend to stay in those days, you always shared the bedroom, didn't you? And you sort of lay there on your mattresses and side by side. And she said, I'm really sorry your parents had that big row. And I went, no, that's just like what we do on a Thursday. And it was really interesting to me that she didn't, obviously she just came from a place where that would have been seen as strife.
Yeah.
But we enjoyed it. I think occasionally it was more, there was sometimes a little bit of, I think around religion, it could get a bit more sensitive if my mother didn't like the sense, which I had that teenage way sometimes of dissing it. She didn't like that. And she thought that was bad for people who lived by their religion or placed great trust in it or didn't have anything else. And she thought I was a bit harsh sometimes. But, I think, hey, now that I've got a teenager or 3, I'm like, I'm right there. I mean, I hear it.
So I have to confess something to you, Anne, and this happens to me a lot on this podcast. I research someone, I kind of read about them, and I start with this very two-dimensional picture of them in my head, and then as I research, they kind of grow and complexify as you're doing. And I did that terrible thing of basically taking your voice and your confidence and associating them with, clearly she went to a private girls' school. How much do you experience that in public with these ways we cluster? And how much have you experienced it with where people expect you to have come from?
That's a great question. I know we're not supposed to say that's a great question on podcast, but I do think that is a great question. And I don't think anyone's ever asked it. But I think you're right. I think if you're quite sort of chatty, confident, maybe a little bit, I came up at a time when I think women in journalism had to fight a bit for the leadership roles. I don't mean that they weren't very successful journalists, but there was a sort of sense, I remember saying to my bosses at Radio 4, it's like lovely to do this and that programme, but actually if you think about it, the formative intellectual voices, the Andrew Marrs of that era, Melvin Bragg, the Doom Bookies, it was always like, they'll tell you how the world works and then you can come on and have a little chat about the rest of it, and talk about health or something. So I've always not felt constrained in any way by that and always been a bit sort of probably a bit chatty and noisy. But it is interesting that people do associate it with background. So I don't know that anyone said to me, you must have been to private school before, but I think there's sometimes that association, or that you went, let's be honest, I've found great state schools for my children in London, which are closer in their demographic to private schools than the one I went to. I'm friendly with Fiona Hill, and there are 2 Fiona Hills in public life. I mean the one who was a national security advisor in the US. She was in the White House under Donald Trump, but not part of the Trump project. She's a Russia expert, great Russia expert, great Putin expert. And I met her when I was growing up because we were on a linguists scheme together in County Durham, which was very visionary. And we learned, a lot by going to Germany on exchanges. I went down more of the German path. I did my Russian later. Fiona became a Russia specialist. She said to me exactly the same thing that you're channeling, that she said people are always, Tony Blair had said to her, you're really from the part of County Durham I think you're from. You didn't go to some posh girls' school in Newcastle. But no, we didn't. I went to St. Bede's Catholic Comprehensive in Lanchester. Go Bedes. And it was very, very solid. It had been a grammar school, but it was comprehensive from the time I went. So it was fully comp. It had some great things. It had a lot of comprehensive schools with, quite big intakes from different parts of the area. Had some problems, I think, with that. But it was partly that, partly, as you suggest, the home background and things, to give you credit, growing up in a house where you have Radio 4 on, as opposed to not introducing children young to, now, these days you can get other things, other podcasts are available. But it does make a difference, I think, because, once we'd had our argument about which church to go to or what we thought of the Labour Party or CND, that was another really big dividing line at the time. I knew that I was able to sort of air my arguments. And then I did go to Oxford. So quite often I will get Oxford educated and McElvoy. It's like, but the bits before were not, quads and, hanging out with hooray Henry's. I grew up in a village in County Durham and I went to school on the bus, like what I call normal school. Some people always just particularly at more conservative newspapers, or they would sort of talk about, state schools. I'd say, well, for most people, I just call it normal school.
Yeah, thank you. I find, even though it probably makes me look a bit bad, I find airing because I think we all do it. We all have these cognitive shorthands. We're scanning someone for, okay, what box do they go in? What are my associations? Am I therefore drawn to them or repelled by them? And I find surfacing all these unsaid things helpful. Tell me, how was your experience at Oxford?
Oh, it was great. I'm in that fortunate position of someone who absolutely flourished there. And it's interesting when I talk to some of my peers, and actually I've just had my son has just left, and I think, has found sort of more pros and cons to it. And, I think there's a great sense of expectation and stress. And I didn't have that. I think some people do find elite universities, whether it's Oxbridge or another one, a mixture of a delight, to be free, to not have to tell anyone when you come in, particularly if you grew up in a sort of rural, semi-rural community. Like the whole question of how you ever got back from anywhere was always, and did you have to leave at such and such a time? And I just felt I was incredibly free to walk around this wonderful place. I read German and philosophy at Wadham College, Oxford. And it was a big, noisy college with a big state school intake, quite progressive by Oxford standards, often sort of seen and still sometimes seen as a bit of a lefty college. But actually I found it was a lefty college with a lot of quite well-heeled London day school people. And kind of, the other thing is, if you've come from outside the bubble and then people say, well, this is this very, eclectic state school lefty background, you think it's still pretty posh coming from where I'm coming from, I can tell you. But as a result, I was very curious, and I made a lot of friends across all sorts of politics, all sorts of backgrounds. I loved my subject. I had a wonderful tutor who I think this September is still teaching a bit, but has been teaching full on for 60 years. Ray Ockenden, who is the doyen of German at Oxford, and very much has driven and sustained the subject in the college and beyond. And he was exacting. He could be very difficult if he thought you'd had a lazy week. He really told you, and used to write the most terrifying margin notes if you thought your metaphors had got sloppy or you missed something. It would occasionally send us all out of a tutorial and then say, none of you really done it, have you? Just come back when you have. But at the same time, he'd be the first to be offering the sherry at 6:00. You would absolutely spend any time he needed with students who are having problems. And I was taught brilliantly in philosophy as well by Michael Eyre, who was a very eminent Locke expert, and then out into the broader university as my time went on, and I knew what I wanted to specialise in, which was to an extent East Germany. Of course, I did a lot more than that. But East Germany and East German literature and censorship became near obsessions.
Were you
and
in
I was
the
incredibly
union?
well supported.
Were you part of the union?
No, I was a Charwell person. I set out, to do student journalism with a lot of other brilliant student journalists who are still around in public life, not yet put out to grass. Christina Lamb, the great war correspondent on the Sunday Times, Rob Ray, who was until recently a big news figure with the BBC. It was a big group of us, really, who were all elbowing our way through Charwell. Adrian Monk, who was practically in charge of the World Economic Forum under Klaus Schwab for a long time. So this little group of us who were all together. David Miliband was making his way through Labour politics. We were all friendly or frenemies in that university. And Boris Johnson, not to be forgotten, was becoming president of the Oxford Union. So I went to the union a lot. I liked the debates. I thought about doing it myself. And then that is a little bit the state school thing. At that time, the union was like fabulously inward-looking public school. I mean, this is the very odd state schoolie who was seen as a sort of white raven. And it wasn't, I just thought, I don't think he can be bothered with this. So I thought, actually, it'll be too much to try to do that. And I wanted to be quite academic. Yeah. So I became editor of Charwell and held Boris's feet to the fire as president of the union, which is so much more fun. And I think he said to me on a number of occasions that I've always looked vaguely disappointed at the end of any encounter with him, which can happen. But, we have good relations because once you've sort of...
When you've been students together.
Been around as, sort of student, kind of ambitious students, I think you always have something in common, even if, shall we say, for all the rock and roll of the Boris Johnson years. You've never given me a fair chance.
And do you have, I sort of don't want to assume it, but, in your house growing up, you had one very committed Labour person and one person who was beginning to question that. Developing political philosophy, a sense of what your political values were.
I'm just trying to make sure I don't retrofit, which is the great danger in this question, isn't it? Is to sort of...
tidy up the story.
It's really interesting. I think I was always very against extremes, and I was always uncomfortable when I came up against them, and that could sometimes be difficult if you're in a world where, if you take, for instance, the group, I always sort of think of it as the sort of Northeast teacherocracy, the pro-CND, think that they hate Margaret Thatcher, with sort of visceral loathing, and partly because of the impacts that she'd had. But I think it was much more than that. I think it was a partisanship, and also as kind of a failure to understand that your own world is part of enough, however stressed it may be, however strongly you feel it's part of a national picture and an international picture. And I think I really did, and I hope I'm not sort of patting myself on the back too much, and I probably am. But from early on, I never liked that. And I was quite challenging even to my teachers, because I did feel, there is a bit of the only religion is Labour, and it is a bit grinding. And I've talked a lot with German friends about that. I had the same experience of saying, yeah, it's a bit like that. The teachers were always SPD. They were always Social Democrats. And at some point, you think, well, hang on, but the country seems to be voting for something else. So what's going on here? I mean, is it... Yeah, and there was also that sense of, I think it's called the sort of bad faith argument, that they're being fooled. And if they only knew, it recurs quite a lot. You sometimes hear it about Brexit, you hear it about from Jeremy Corbyn about, on that wing of the Labour Party. And I think I became quite sceptical about this from about 15, 16 and quite challenging. I think, of course, it was socially just not at all acceptable to have much interest in conservatism. So that, for me, came later when I was able to... I mean, really, other than people like my mother who were getting a bit fed up with the Labour Party, so they were being driven that way. They were not... But I think a lot of Labour people, as Tony Blair put his finger on and built the vote base from it, are naturally small c conservative, like my mother. She was conservationist. She didn't like too much change too fast. She grew up in a family, her father had been a very dominant figure and had been the sort of what they call the deputy, the head of effectively making the pit operational, looking after the miners, but he'd risen from being a miner himself. And I think she was very much like, you have to look after people, but there's also self-responsibility is a big thing. So I think that weight. Where it was difficult was then my first serious sort of love affair when I was 17 with someone who was very sort of politically engaged on he was certainly in no way a sort of crazy lefty. He was a very thoughtful man, but, it was absolutely, we went on a day, it was a sort of CND march. Well, it wasn't much of a march really, it was like a little group walking to Pontop Pike, which I think is in some way connected to being an early warning signal. It's a broadcast, station thing up there, big mast just above where I lived. But to be honest, that was kind of for dating and not for CND. But I did meet through that a more interesting, probably more university-oriented group of people who had those politics. And many years later, when my mother was very ill, a lady called Theos, and she was in fact Palestinian. She was pro-PLO, she was CND, she was, if you've got a blacklist, I want to be on it, as Billy Bragg once brilliantly put it. And she's a very, very nice and interesting woman. Her politics were like fully, as I understood it, just in case she hears this, but I would say were very sort of Corbyny. And I was in a sort of woebegone state, checking out of the local supermarket just before Christmas. My mother was very, very ill by this point, wasn't going to live much longer. And I thought, I'd better make some Christmas lunch for my father, a miserable experience. So I went and got this sort of tiniest turkey, and I was standing there, very distracted. And behind me, as 20 years on, was Thea. So we said hello and things, and she said, after a bit of, what are you doing? Oh, you're a journalist. And then she said, now, about the PLO, I just want to make... And so we had to start having this argument in checking out of...
You were thinking, I really don't want to talk about
supermarket. I'm standing there with this sort of sad turkey. And but, I enjoyed that. And I really liked that there were people who challenged my views. But yes, I think I was becoming a quite sort of centrist, and I got interested in the economic argument. I knew there was something wrong with the argument that it was just about spending. The Northeast absolutely needed more investment, but I kind of guessed that probably wasn't going to be
the full picture.
The only answer. Yeah.
And you dive straight into journalism and have had this incredibly stellar career. I kind of want to know what you love about it, and I'm interested underneath that if you have it as a sense of vocation, if you have a kind of philosophy of what journalism is.
I think I do. My husband, who's also a journalist, says that for me, it's a vocation. He said for him, it was something he sort of came to by trying other things and then thinking, hey, well, interesting current affairs, and I like to communicate. But for me, it was always clear. I mean, it was clear I really used to write up reports when I was a teenager and stick them in scrapbooks, and I had all those tells. Kind of, I think it would be hard to say I wasn't going to be in some way in the media. Vocation's a really interesting word. I think the vocation came for me really when I went to cover East Germany and had that very good fortune. I had invested a lot in East Germany and spent a lot of time there in the late 80s. And I was thinking about that. I was preparing for your podcast, Elizabeth, that's also an area where when you say vocation, to me, it was important. Everyone says they want to tell the truth, hopefully, to enlighten. To me, it was also, I had a very strong sense of maybe I'm really lucky to be able to go to places that I think people I know would be really interested in this or that angle if I could only bring it home to them. So how would I do it? So often in East Germany, as well as covering the big story about Politburo, and as we headed towards the fall of the wall, I did a lot of reporting from churches and from the Green and peace movement in churches. And in a sense, some of the defaults of some of those people were a bit like the old, sort of CND bunch I'd kind of sort of skirted arguments with when I was a teenager. But the context was so different because they were opposing an authoritarian regime. They were taking immense personal risks to their safety, and many of them were prepared to go to prison or be kicked out of the country for it. And that brought me a bit back towards the church, actually through the Lutheran tradition of this strong engagement. I'm not saying there wasn't also great Catholics in East Germany sort of slightly were encouraged, including by their not great archbishop, who was a bit too close to the system for my liking, to keep their heads down. But, these extraordinarily brave people, Christian Führer, the Pfarrer, pastor in Leipzig, the Schorlemmer, Friedrich Schorlemmer in Wittenberg, the home of Luther, who was even more, I think he was certainly to the left of Christian Führer. But they had something in common, that they saw this very clever opportunity to use these peace prayers as a way which the state couldn't really say it was against peace, because it kept saying it was for peace, because that's why it kept trying to infiltrate all my friends in CND. But at the same time, it was pro-Moscow, and it was really the hymn sheet came from Moscow. But it was harder then if it was gathered in churches to break it up as the tensions grew. And then, of course, these churches and these peace prayers became the most extraordinary gathering place for thousands, tens of thousands of people who were not there primarily at all for the religion, but they were looking for new centres of leadership and thought. And it was the sacred space that offered them that. And that, was inspiring in a way that still makes my, sort of gives me goosebumps to think about that. Because I also think, at what point would I have joined in? If I'd lived in that society, I was doing quite nicely. I'd probably got to some, form of decent higher education, or would I have kept my head down? And for how long? So when people talk about biographies and who joined the Stasi and what they did, I'm always a little bit, loathe the Stasi, and it destroyed the lives of a lot of people very close to me. But I also do, as you first question said, there's that little bit of the 10% of you that says, what would I have done? And that's a question that religion maybe helps you put.
Yes, it maybe asks it more regularly and insistently within the rhythms and the rituals, I think. That's what I value about it.
Yes.
I find it hard to stay loyal to my values. I need a lot of scaffolding. And that's what my practice of faith often gives me, I think.
And also, don't you find that when you're in a situation where you see, and I think about it in Ukraine today, I also think about it because I was later covered wars in the Balkans, Chechnya, I was Moscow bureau chief for the Times, and I have a lot of very close Russian friends, and some are still there, and some are keeping their head down, and some have gone to Baltic states, etc., or just trying to get out anyway. And I think where faith fits in their lives and what you call the scaffolding and the way that the Ukrainian churches in London are fulfilling that function. How do you keep that scaffolding when your life is under such pressure that, you talk about faith being tested because I don't like aspects of the Catholic Church, which I don't. But now imagine having it tested because
it's illegal to practice.
Just a merciful God. It doesn't seem to have let you down if you're under bombardment, or indeed if you've lost people or in danger of losing people in the war, or you've had to flee, so you've lost that connection to your, as you nicely put it, your scaffolding, your weekly worship, or even your monthly drop-in, or just your sense of nodding when you pass the church and thinking, I was married there. And I think that sense of religion as a kind of support through incredibly difficult times for people is something I sort of learned to appreciate rather better once I'd done the harder side of European history.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you a very nosy question, which I think for British people is more intrusive than asking about their sex life, which is, what does your practice look like now, your spirituality? Where do those kind of deeply profound metaphysical things show up in your life?
Yeah, my answer might be a bit disappointing in that I'm not a regular observer. I did the thing with children of thing. We should, if we're going to do some of them, they were all initially in Catholic education. We should actually go to church. We don't want to be those people who sort of drop their kids at school and then stop going to church. I did find, some of the, we weren't lucky with our local church, and the preaching just didn't resonate with me at all. And so I sort of looked around and just started to go to different services if I was somewhere. Very eclectic. It's an all-you-can-eat buffet for me. I will go to a Church of England service. I've been to a Ukrainian service when I was, where was I? Somewhere very odd. It wasn't in Ukraine either. I was just in a city somewhere in Western Europe. I'll come back to. I think it was in Rome, actually. It was a beautiful Ukrainian church. It was in Rome. And I just thought, I'll go there.
Yeah.
Sunday morning. And it's wonderful noise coming out. I was thinking I'll go down to the Vatican, but then I'll start arguing in my head with Pope Francis, so maybe I won't do that. And I ended up Sunday stand, mainly, almost all stand in the Ukrainian Orthodox church at the back, and there was incantation and music, and I knew it a bit from the Russian, but it was obviously different. It was in Ukrainian, it was slightly different rituals, and I found that very comforting and restorative. So I think it does look a bit spotty, my observance.
There's no judgment here.
That said, when, no, I sort of think about it myself, it wouldn't be a bad idea to go a bit more often. What I do like to do, and my husband does as well, so this works out quite well. If we're in a city, we will spend, we were in a city, Girona, in Spain, that I didn't know recently, and he went to the cathedral and said, actually, cathedral is knockout. You should go tomorrow. And I said, well, let's both go back together and let's spend proper time in the cathedral. So quite often what we'll do is we do the sort of run around and look at the wonderful windows and read the history, but then try to spend maybe an extra 20 minutes. Now, this would be a trade's description problem to call it prayer, but I do sit and try to shut out the just thinking, oh, this is quite interesting because it was the seat of the somebody's from 1600. But I try not to do that. I try to just sit. And I was worrying about my daughter's A-levels. And then I started to think about this, I figured out there's little point in praying for A-levels because I had 3 of them. It's just like they do what they do. But then I started to think, well, what is it you're really praying for? And is it, because we all know it's crazy to pray for 3 A's or whatever. So I started to think, what is it that you're really praying for? Is it the person, or is it that you support the person better? And so that took me into quite a nice reflective space. So that was my last encounter with the Almighty, and thanks for the A-levels up there. Yeah, it was close, but we got there. Do that, and then I think the other thing I do, which is sort of mental, and I bet a lot of people talk to you about this on the show, Elizabeth, is I do yoga, and I like to try to. I find, I'm really interested in the way that yoga, you can be in this sort of sweaty gym and they'll be really full and there's people in terrifyingly tight lycra. Actually saying, do the same things that we do in religious observance in the Christian tradition in the Mass, about offering things up and sacrifice, not sacrificing in the sort of, perhaps the way of the Catholic Mass, but offering it up for something that isn't yourself, or thanking yourself for taking time. So a bit of me thinks these things are called borrowed and it's all a bit of, modern hokery. But I am interested in the way it does sort of meet partly a religious need. And even if it is in the sort of few percent zone, I think that's probably a bit of where my sacred goes these days.
Yes.
To Namaste world.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think, it's, for lots of us, it's this kind of patchwork of moments that we don't always have language for, and that we don't always have a lot of scaffolding to help us with, but we know we need them. I wanted to ask about Across the Red Line, and you have had this career where you've done a lot of classic debates. We cross over briefly on the Moral Maze. There's a lot of Newsnighty, and let's just get the two. And I remember this from casting the Moral Maze. Let's just get the two, and the code is clearest. But what we really mean is most extreme forms of the arguments, and put them up against each other. People who don't have a desire to caveat or add nuance, because that's, and it was for a good reason. It was because that was the clearest way to give the listener a sense of the options, or the reader, this is how we show them all the different ways you can think about this, and then we test the things. But you have clearly come to the conclusion that has, it may be deep problems, or is certainly not all we need. What is it that you've learnt through doing Across the Red Line?
I think you put your finger on why we sort of came up with it. It was basically in a discussion with Phil Tinline, a very good documentary maker that I'd worked with at the BBC, who was also an intellectually questing person. And I think we both knew that when we were doing, we'd made lots of 10-part series about conservatism, socialism, liberalism, and they were storytelling about how these ideas came to be. They were not trying to say, is this right, wrong, good or bad? And then I suppose I said to them, Phil, do you not sometimes feel when you're in an argument that initially I wanted to call it cliff edge, probably a terrible name, but that was where the thinking came from, where is the cliff edge of my own certainty here? And so let's say you take people who are very strongly, very liberal on immigration and very hostile to what Suella Braverman is doing on immigration or asylum seeking. But basically, you kind of think the more the merrier. But do you really then, like at what level, is there any level of immigration that you would say the country can't absorb or communities struggle with or will have adverse consequences? And I think for most people, they'd find it kind of difficult to put a figure on that. But it clearly exists. So to me, that was a sort of cliff edge in my own thinking. And I think it exists for a lot of people. And I always ask people in the wrap up on Across the Red Line is where they feel least comfortable about their own argument. Because I think that's where you find that space that you're referring to. And as you say, if you've done those bookings and people get very trained to come in and say, I want to win this argument. I am so going to win this argument that we're going to have on this.
And that's what all the incentives are set up to do, right? Your incentive is not to listen and change your mind. Your incentive is to win.
Yeah. And whether people change their mind is always a moot point. A lot of people ask that, and as you can imagine, on big picture questions. And also, if you're invested enough to, because you've spent your life campaigning about it, or come to a view of something, or you're a journalist who's sort of out there in one position on the government, on the economy, on it, the Russia crisis, on America, you're unlikely to go, do you know what? I've just had a moment. It's like it's Damascene conversion. But what I do think you do get, what I've really enjoyed is the moment when we had a wonderful moment, and I think it was actually very early in the first series when Charles Moore, great figure of conservative thought, biographer of Margaret Thatcher, editor of the Daily Telegraph for many years, debated with Hugh Muir from The Guardian, now of The Guardian, who had been the only black British reporter in the newsroom when Charles had been editor in his pomp at The Telegraph, and also in a time when nobody seemed to think that was odd, or that something perhaps should be done a bit more about it. And he just ended up, saying to Charles Moore, do you understand a bit more about what that was like? And he said, I didn't have a terrible time. I'm just telling you it was quite odd. And Charles Moore said, if I'd had your life experiences, which also meant if he were to change his race, he said, I would think more like you than I think like me now. And I think once you've got there, it's not that you don't agree. I mean, one's on the right and the other's on the left. But we'll get to that point when you say, I do see if these things were different, that I might be different. Now, to me, that's a much more imaginative world where you can start to have another conversation than if I simply sat them down and said, you're left, you're right, and then give them a football to kick about. I can tell you exactly which goal they'll kick it into. And so can you. Not just because you've been a booker on shows, but so can a nice proportion of the audience.
It comes back
who always get in touch and say they like that aspect.
Yeah, forgive me. But it comes back to what you said very early on about your sacred. It's that ability to see someone else as a full person, not as a badge, or a representative of a position.
And it's hard, isn't it? I mean, it's hard when you encounter people whose views you find so objectionable, or indeed who themselves are having damaging impacts. How do you do that? I mean, that is something I think a lot of journalists struggle with, and you get it in the question how you cover Donald Trump. And if you go too far in one direction, you're accused of normalising the Trump phenomenon. If you go in the other direction, you've just got lots of screamy journalism saying,
how terrible.
Terrible. He's a bad man, someone said to me the other day in a conversation 3 times. And I was like, well,
yes,
I think you're probably right. Yeah, I think I'm pretty sure you're right. But I'm not sure that would advance the what to do about it very far. And it's really hard when people believe things very strongly because they do think I also think, well, when the idea of sort of liberals, left liberals, whatever, it's a bit unfair to put people in baskets. But what happened with Brexit and the view of people who didn't agree with them, certain parts of journalism, certain parts of politics are like this, is the reason is fundamentally, sometimes it's arrogance, it can be, but it's often much more that you're so convinced your ideas are right for society. Yeah. What can be wrong with a liberal open society? Well, of course, then anybody who stands up on the other side has to grate on you or jar with you because you think they're doing harm.
Yeah.
But if you don't engage with it, in my view anyway, you create more harm, more frustration, you get less debate, and these groups just separate more and more. And that's you asked if I had a sort of guiding vocation. I suppose it's just keep talking, really.
What have you changed since doing, or how have you changed since doing Across the Red Line? Do you approach things differently?
The element of having conflict resolution, we have 2 conflict resolution helpers who come in just when the 2 people are about to go off into their fiery debate, because they're really hard to stop. You've probably heard it on air. Listeners will have heard me trying to pull it back, like 2 sort of racehorses going in opposite directions. And what's brilliant there is I say, well, I've done my bit now. And you have Gabrielle Rifkin or Louisa Weinstein, very different styles and different skill sets, but they both come from that world of getting people to not only listen to the other person, but there's a very clever thing, which sounds a bit tricksy, but actually I think is the core of the programme. It's just I have to put your case in my own voice, not Elizabeth thinks this, because I'll always signal it. That's clearly crazy what she's thinking. But I have to sort of own it and say a view opposite to my life, my experience, what it is. And you'd be surprised how hard it is. And it's this whole kind of school of attentive listening, absorption. I've tried to do it more, particularly in family situations where you really want to say, just get on and do it because it's a good idea, or don't do that because it's a bad idea, or I've told you before. Now, I fail more often than I succeed, but I have tried just that thing of turning the globe around a bit and saying, from where you're sitting, this seems like a really good idea. And you might even be right in a way that I can't see at the moment. Yeah. But on the whole, I do think maybe, you should tidy your room. So I've tried to be a bit less kind of stuck in, I try to understand why people who seem to be acting irrationally may have something else going on. I think a lot of quite rational, quite driven people, I'm a bit impatient sometimes if I think arguments are not good and I just wonder why they're being made. So I've tried to be a bit more listen-y.
And thank you so much for speaking to me today on The Sacred.
Oh, you've made me think about a lot, Elizabeth, and thank you very much for having me. It was all pleasure. Thank you.
So the first thing to know about this interview is I was a bit nervous about it because there's very little about Anne as a person available in public. She's had this long and illustrious career of interviewing other people and writing opinion pieces about policy ideas or culture. But as far as I could tell, she's either never said yes to or never been asked to talk about herself in any particular depth. And so I went into the interview a bit worried that she wouldn't be comfortable with that I would feel like I was probing for a sense of her as a person and that she, for whatever reason, didn't feel able to share that. So honestly, it was such a lovely surprise and very refreshing when she really volunteered quite a lot about her inner life and her values. I loved that phrase she used, lapsed but defensive, about her Catholicism. I think it probably will chime with quite a lot of people. Those early experiences with the Catholic Church have clearly really stayed with her and shaped her, given her a sense of the value of those traditions and stories, even if she doesn't always know how to position herself in relation to it. The way she talked about her sense of the sacred in relation to that did sound quite a lot like a conscience, really, a sense of a check on the worst parts of herself. And I so appreciated her being honest about sometimes being a bit ruthless. I think it's obvious that in some industries, in order to be successful, most people have to develop quite sharp elbows. I think particularly for women and women of Anne's generation, a streak of ruthlessness may have been an unavoidable thing that she had to develop in order to work in that area. And being honest about that and then talking about the limits of it and how she does sometimes worry that it means that she depersonalizes people. It's just that kind of honesty, I think, really helps us all. That those of you listening who know that you've got a slightly ruthless streak, I find it very, it's very deep need in us, right, as humans, to be recognized or to feel that sense of recognition when someone says something about our own deep experience and we say, me too. And I just really valued that. Class assumptions, my goodness. Yeah. I try and be honest. Speaking of which, I try and be honest on this show, both with guests where it feels appropriate and in these reflections about some of the things I'm learning and some of the prejudices and nonsense and unlovely parts of myself that this project throws up and surfaces. And I do work in tribalism and polarization, and it just is sort of an unavoidable fact about human beings that we make assumptions about people and we cluster traits and we have associations. And in the UK, it probably sounds, we have quite a big listenership now outside Britain, and the class stuff in the UK probably sounds a bit very weird. But very often in the UK, still, and I don't know where this comes from, it's just sort of ambient. There's a sort of class calculation. How does someone speak? How do they dress? How do they present themselves? It's not, I don't think, out of a sort of like seeking to kowtow to the aristocracy or anything. It's just one of the identity signifiers that we are constantly trying to work out who we're talking to, right? And where to position them in our mental filing system. And class is part of that. And I did just assume that Anne had been head girl at a private girls' school because she presents with that very particular forthright, hearty confidence, which I really like, by the way. I would love the world to be run by those kind of women, frankly. Who have some of those characteristics, not just people who have come from that background, let's be clear. But that's not her story. And it does, I think, usually feel healthy and helpful to surface it and to notice it in ourselves, maybe. Write and tell me. She spoke about her time at Oxford, and I think we know that densely networked webs of friends are often found in positions of power. And that people cluster, right? Now I'm writing a book, I realized there's loads of people in my life who've written a book, right? It is not a mystery, the way we cluster and the way we often end up with friends in the same industries or in the same area of us. It's just one of those things that anyone who follows UK politics will have pricked their ears up about because it can sound worrying. Anne went to university with Boris. She knew him as a hapless teenager. How does that affect how she covers him, for example? Like if they all know each other, can they tell we, the people who didn't go to university with them, the truth? And I've sat with that reaction in me as someone who champions relationships and champions the fact that you are better able to understand a person up close, that you're better able to understand a person if you know their story, and that your heart is likely to soften towards a person up close and if you know their story, and if you've walked with them for any amount of time, and that is an unalloyed good. But it presses on that thing of what is journalism supposed to be doing? Is there such a thing as objectivity? I don't think so. And so where can a pre-existing relationship help us understand someone, and where might actually that heart softening be a problem? That maybe sometimes in order to be good journalism, a journalist does need to treat a politician more of an object and less as a person. It's going against some very deep sacred values of me to say that, but it's a question that I'm asking. Where is it? Where might it be a good? Because I think the public debate often assumes it's a bad if people in our public life all know each other. And where might it actually be a problem that needs an eye kept on it? I think Anne said this very meaningful thing about being in East Germany, seeing how the churches were real centres of resistance. And at its best, maybe that's what keeps me coming back to the often disappointing institutions of the church, that at its best, in times of darkness and crisis, faith communities can function as centres of resistance to tyranny, and they definitely did that in East Germany. And ask this question, would I have stood up against tyranny? Would I have refused to sell out my friends? Would I have resisted? Would I have been part of a resistance? Would I be part of the resistance if we were taken over by a tyrannical power? And I do think, along with what do you want people to say about you at your funeral, that's a really good question to be asking on the regular. Do I have the moral courage to resist evil? And I know that sounds grandiose and dramatic, but who knows what the future holds? And developing that kind of character is a good in and of itself. We always need people of moral courage and integrity. And I'm more and more convinced that we don't grow that kind of character accidentally, that we have to practice it. That one of the first is working out what are our values that we want to stay loyal to, what is sacred to us personally or as part of a community. And then how do we stop the longshore drift happening? The strong formation of a consumer individualistic culture. How do we create counter formation to that in order to practice our values, to stay loyal to the things we want our life to be defined by, to develop moral courage? And for me, it's my faith community. It's being part of a regular, it's the scaffolding, it's the trellis. But I think it's unusual now, actually, for people to be members of those kind of communities. The majority of you as listeners maybe won't be. And so I'd love to know where do we find places to practice moral courage? Where do we find centres of resistance to the way our culture forms us into the worst forms of ourselves, into the people we don't want to be? It's a big question that I've posed there. I really valued Anne being very honest about a kind of patchwork spirituality that comes and goes, church that comes and goes, the sort of meaningfulness of some of her yoga practice, praying for her kids, these very ordinary, very beautiful parts of human life. And I felt sad that she felt she needed to apologize for that almost, that I think that's probably closer to where most people are on their seeking of the sacred and their seeking of meaning. I don't want to devalue that. It may be that I heard a hunger in her for something a bit more robust and, great. But again, naming our normal and stating our obvious can be very liberating for other people. And finally, this sense of the best thing you can do if you want to be a kind of depolarizing person is to state things from another person's perspective, to put yourself in their shoes. It's such an old cliche. But many of our cliches are like deeply profound truth that we just need to find ways to restate so we can really hear them. If you had lived someone's life, if you were forced to tell their story from their perspective, how would it shift you? And what are the limits of that? Sometimes I worry if I do this job for too long, if I get too good at this, I will just have no principles, no solid ground of what I think. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think in the main, it's a way we grow. We grow our souls. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Sacred. My name is Elizabeth Oldfield, and our production team are Dan Turner and Fiona Howarth. We are edited by Drew Hawley, and our music is by Luke Stanley. I'd love you to get in touch. Let me know what you think. Share an episode. When someone sends an episode to a friend so that they can talk about it, that is like chef's kiss. That is very close to the heart of what we want to be stimulating and provoking deeper, better, more meaningful, more human conversations between people. I'd love you to let me know, but if you don't, I'm still glad it's happening. I have a Substack. I would love you to follow that if you are interested in my wider writing. Find us on social media. Leave us a glowing review if you want to. That's all from me for today. I will speak to you next episode.